Chapter 19 of Mary Louise by L. Frank Baum. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 19 An Artful Confession. This Monday morning Bub appeared at the lodge and had the car ready before Mr. Conant had finished his breakfast. Mary Louise decided to drive to Millbank with them, just for the pleasure of the trip, and although the boy evidently regarded her presence with distinct disapproval, he made no verbal objection. As Irene wheeled herself out upon the porch to see them start, Mary Louise called to her. "Here's your chair cushion, Irene, lying on the steps and quite wet with dew. I never supposed you could be so careless. And you'd better sew up that rip before it gets bigger," she added, handing the cushion to her friend. "I will," Irene quietly returned. Bub proved himself a good driver before they had gone a mile, and it pleased Mr. Conant to observe that the boy made the trip down the treacherous mountain road with admirable caution. Once on the level, however, he stepped on it, as he expressed it, and dashed past the huddle and over the plain, as if training for the Grand Prix. It amused Mary Louise to watch their quaint little driver, barefooted and in blue jeans and hickory shirt, with the heavy Scotch golf cap pulled over his eyes, taking his task of handling the car as seriously as might any city chauffeur, and executing it fully as well. During the trip the girl conversed with Mr. Conant. "Do you remember our referring to an old letter the other day?" she asked. "Yes," said he. "Irene found it in one of those second-hand books she bought in New York, and she said it spoke of both my mother and my grandfather." "The deuce it did!" he exclaimed, evidently startled by the information. "It must have been quite an old letter," continued Mary Louise musingly. "What did it say?" he demanded, rather eagerly for the unemotional lawyer. "I don't know. Irene wouldn't let me read it." "Wouldn't, eh? That's odd. Why didn't you tell me of this before I left the lodge?" "I didn't think to tell you until now. And, Uncle Peter, what do you think of Miss Lord?" "A very charming lady. What did Irene do with the letter?" "I think she left it in the book, and the book was stolen the very next day." "Great Caesar! Who knew about that letter?" "Miss Lord was present when Irene found the letter, and she heard Irene exclaim that it was all about my mother, as well as about my grandfather." "Miss Lord?" "Yes." "And the book was taken by someone?" "The next day. We missed it after Miss Lord had visited the den alone." "Huh." He rode for a while in silence. "Really," he muttered, as if to himself, "I ought to go back. I ought not to take for granted the fact that this old letter is unimportant. However, Irene has read it, and if it happened to be of value I'm sure the girl would have told me about it." "Yes, she certainly would have told you," agreed Mary Louise. "But she declared that even I would not be interested in reading it." "That's the only point that perplexes me," said the lawyer. "Just that one point." "Why?" asked the girl. But Mr. Conant did not explain. He sat bolt upright on his seat, staring at the back of Bub's head for the rest of the journey. Mary Louise noticed that his fingers constantly fumbled with the locket on his watch chain. As the lawyer left the car at the station he whispered to Mary Louise, "Tell Irene that I know about the letter, and just say to her that I consider her a very cautious girl. Don't say anything more. And don't, for heaven's sake, suspect poor Miss Lord. I'll talk with Irene when I return on Friday." On their way back Bub maintained an absolute silence until after they had passed the huddle. Before they started to climb the hill road, however, the boy suddenly slowed up, halted the car, and turned deliberately in his seat to face Mary Louise. "Bein' as how you're a gal," said he, "I ain't got much use for you, and that's a fact. I don't say it's your fault, nor that you wouldn't 'a' made a passable boy if you'd been borned that way. But you're right on one thing, and don't forget I told you so. That woman at Bigby's ain't on the square." "How do you know?" asked Mary Louise, delighted to be taken into Bub's confidence. "The critter's too slick," he explained, raising one bare foot to the cushion beside him and picking a sliver out of his toe. "Her eyes ain't got their shutters raised. Eyes are like winders, but hers you can't see through. I don't know nothin' about that slick gal at Bigby's, and I don't want to know nothin'. But I heerd what you said to the boss, and what he said to you, and I guess you're right in sizin' the critter up, and the boss is wrong." With this he swung round again and started the car, nor did he utter another word until he ran the machine into the garage. During Mary Louise's absence Irene had had a strange and startling experience with their beautiful neighbour. The girl had wheeled her chair out upon the bluff to sun herself and read. Mrs. Conant being busy in the house, when Agatha Lord strolled up to her with a smile and a pleasant "Good morning." "I'm glad to find you alone," said she, seating herself beside the wheeled chair. "I saw Mr. Conant and Mary Louise pass the Bigby place, and decided this would be a good opportunity for you and me to have a nice, quiet talk together, so I came over." Irene's face was a bit disdainful as she remarked, "I found the cushion this morning." "What cushion do you refer to?" asked Agatha, with a puzzled expression. Irene frowned. "We cannot talk frankly together, when we are at cross purposes," she complained. "Very true, my dear, but you seem inclined to talk in riddles. Do you deny any knowledge of my chair cushion?" "I do." "I must accept your statement, of course. What do you wish to say to me, Miss Lord?" "I would like to establish a more friendly understanding between us. You are an intelligent girl, and cannot fail to realize that I have taken a warm interest in your friend Mary Louise Burrows. I want to know more about her and about her people, who seem to have cast her off. You are able to give me this information, I am sure, and by doing so you may be instrumental in assisting your friend materially." It was an odd speech, odd and insincere. Irene studied the woman's face curiously. "Who are you, Miss Lord?" she inquired. "Your neighbour." "Why are you our neighbour?" "I am glad to be able to explain that. To you, in confidence. I am trying to clear the name of Colonel Weatherby from a grave charge, the charge of high treason." "In other words, you are trying to discover where he is," retorted Irene impatiently. "No, my dear, you mistake me. It is not important to my mission at present to know where Colonel Weatherby is staying. I am merely seeking relevant information, such information as you are in a position to give me." "I, Miss Lord?" "Yes, to be perfectly frank, I want to see the letter which you found in that book." "Why should you attach any importance to that?" "I was present, you will remember, when you discovered it. I marked your surprise and perplexity, your fear and uncertainty, as you glanced first at the writing and then at Mary Louise. You determined not to show your friend that letter, because it would disturb her, yet you inadvertently admitted, in my hearing, that it referred to the girl's mother, and, which is vastly more important, to her grandfather." "Well, what then, Miss Lord?" "Colonel Weatherby is a man of mystery. He has been hunted by the government agents for nearly 10 years, during which time he has successfully eluded them. If you know anything of the government service you know it has 1,000 eyes, 10,000 ears, and a myriad of long arms to seize its malefactors. It has not yet captured Colonel Weatherby." "Why has he been hunted all these years?" "He is charged, as I said, with high treason. By persistently evading capture he has tacitly admitted his guilt." "But he is innocent!" cried Irene indignantly. Miss Lord seemed surprised, yet not altogether ill-pleased at the involuntary exclamation. "Indeed!" she said softly. "Could you prove that statement?" I think so," stammered the girl, regretting her hasty avowal. "Then why not do so, and by restoring Mary Louise to her grandfather make them both happy?" Irene sat silent, trapped. "This is why I have come to you," continued Agatha, very seriously. "I am employed by those whose identity I must not disclose, to sift this mystery of Colonel Weatherby to the bottom, if possible, and then to fix the guilt where it belongs. By accident you have come into possession of certain facts that would be important in unravelling the tangle, but through your unfortunate affliction you are helpless to act in your own capacity. You need an ally with more strength and experience than yourself, and I propose you accept me as that ally. Together we may be able to clear the name of James J. Hathaway, who now calls himself Colonel James Weatherby, from all reproach, and so restore him to the esteem of his fellow men." "But we must not do that, even if we could!" cried Irene, quite distressed by the suggestion. "Why not, my dear?" The tone was so soft and cat-like that it alarmed Irene instantly. Before answering she took time to reflect. To her dismay she found this woman was gradually drawing from her the very information she had declared she would preserve secret. She knew well that she was no match for Agatha Lord in a trial of wits. Her only recourse must be a stubborn refusal to explain anything more. "Colonel Weatherby," she said slowly, "has better information than I of the charge against him, and his reasons for keeping hidden, yet he steadfastly refuses to proclaim his innocence, or to prove he is unjustly accused, which he might very well do if he chose. You say you are working in his interests, and, allowing that, I am satisfied he would bitterly reproach anyone who succeeded in clearing his name by disclosing the truth." This argument positively amazed Agatha Lord, as it might well amaze anyone who had not read the letter. In spite of her supreme confidence of the moment before, the woman now suddenly realized that this promising interview was destined to end disastrously to her plans. "I am so obtuse that you will have to explain that statement," she said with assumed carelessness. But Irene was now on guard, and replied, "Then our alliance is dissolved. I do not intend, Miss Lord, to betray such information as I may have stumbled upon unwittingly. You express interest in Mary Louise and her grandfather, and say you are anxious to serve them. So am I. Therefore, I beg you, in their interests, to abandon any further attempt to penetrate this secret." Agatha was disconcerted. "Show me the letter," she urged, as a last resort. "If on reading it I find your position is justifiable you must admit that it is now bewildering I will agree to abandon the investigation altogether." "I will not show you the letter," declared the girl, positively. The woman studied her face. "But you will consider this conversation confidential, will you not?" "Since you request it, yes." "I do not wish our very pleasant relations, as neighbours, disturbed. I would rather the Conants at Mary Louise did not suspect I am here on any especial mission." "Very well." "In truth," continued Agatha, "I am growing fond of you all, and this is a real vacation to me, after a period of hard work in the city which racked my nerves. Before long I must return to the old strenuous life, so I wish to make the most of my present opportunities." "I understand." No further reference was made to the letter or to Colonel Weatherby. They talked of other things for a while, and when Miss Lord went away there seemed to exist, at least upon the surface, the same friendly relations that had formerly prevailed between them. Irene, reflecting upon the interview, decided that while she had admitted more than was wise, she had stopped short of exposing the truth about Colonel Weatherby. The letter was safely hidden now. She defied even Miss Lord to find it. If she could manage to control her tongue, hereafter, the secret was safe in her possession. Thoughtfully, she wheeled herself back to the den, and finding the room deserted, she ventured to peep into her novel hiding-place. Yes, the precious letter was still safe. But this time, in her abstraction, she failed to see the face at the window. End of Chapter 19. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 20 of Mary Louise by L. Frank Baum. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 20. Diamond Cut Diamond. Tuesday afternoon, Miss Lord's big touring car stood at the door of Hillcrest Lodge, for Agatha had invited the Conant party to ride with her to Millbank. Irene was tucked into the back seat in a comfortable position, and beside her sat Mrs. Conant, who was going to make a few purchases at the village store. Mary Louise rode on the front seat with Agatha, who loved to drive her car and understood it perfectly. When they drove away there was no one left in the house but Sarah Judd, the servant girl, who was washing the lunch dishes. Bub was in the old shed-like garage, however, washing and polishing Will Morrison's old car, on which the paint was so cracked and faded that the boy's attempt to improve its appearance was a desperate one. Sarah, through the kitchen window, watched Bub for a time, rather sharply. Then she went out on the bluff and looked down in the valley. Miss Lord's big car was just passing the Huddle on its way up the valley. Sarah turned and re-entered the house. Her meek and diffident expression of countenance had quite disappeared. Her face now wore a look of stern determination, and the blue eyes deepened and grew shrewd. She walked straight to the den, and without hesitation approached the farther wall and took from its peg Will Morrison's fine hunting rifle. In the stock was a hollow chamber for cartridges, for the rifle was of the type known as a repeater. Sliding back the steel plate that hid this cavity, Sarah drew from it a folded paper of a yellow tint, and calmly spread it on the table before her. Then she laid down the rifle, placed a chair at the table, and with an absorbed attention read the letter from beginning to end, the letter that Irene had found in the book. It was closely written on both sides of the thin sheet, evidently of foreign make, and although the writing was faded it was clearly legible. After the first perusal Sarah Judd leaned her elbows on the table, and her head on her hands, and proceeded to study the epistle still more closely. Then she drew from her pocket a notebook and pencil, and with infinite care made a copy of the entire letter, writing it in her book in shorthand. This accomplished, she replaced the letter in the rifle stock, and hung the weapon on its pegs again. Both the window and the glass door of the den faced the back yard. Sarah opened the door and stood there in deep thought, watching Bub at his work. Then she returned to the table and opening a drawer, drew out a sheet of blank paper. On this she wrote the following words: John Folger, 1601 F Street, Washington, D.C. Nothing under sterling over letter bobbing every kernel sad mother making frolic better quick. If England rumples paper Russia admires money. Sarah Judd. Each word of this preposterous phrasing she wrote after consulting another book hidden cleverly among the coils of her red hair, a tiny book, it was, filled with curious characters. When the writing was finished the girl seemed well satisfied with her work. After tucking away the book in its former place she went to her room, got her purse, and then proceeded to the shed and confronted Bub. "I want you to drive this car to Millbank, to the telegraph office at the railway station," said Sarah. Bub gave her a scornful look. "You're crazy," he said, and went on with his polishing. "That needn't worry you," retorted the girl. "It don't," declared Bub. "You can drive, and you're going to," she continued. "I've got to send this telegram quick, and you've got to take it." She opened her purse and placed 2 coins on the fender of the car. "There's $1 to pay for the message, and there's a $5 gold piece to pay you for your trouble." Bub gave a gasp. He came up beside her and stared at the money. Then he turned to look at Sarah Judd. "What's up?" he demanded. "Private business. Don't ask questions; you'd only get lies for answers. Go and earn your money." "Miss Conant, she's gone to Millbank herself. If she sees me there, I'll get fired. The boss'll fire me himself anyhow for usin' the car when he told me not to." "How much do you get a week?" asked Sarah. 4 bits. That's about $2 a month. In 2 months the Conants will move back to the city and you'll have earned $4. Why, Bub, it's cheaper for you to take this $5 gold piece and get fired than to work for 2 months for $4. Bub scratched his head in perplexity. "You ain't countin' on the fun o' workin'," he suggested. "I'm counting on that $5. 8 bits to $1, 40 bits altogether. Why, it's a fortune, Bub." He took out his knife, looked around for a stick to whittle, and finding none, put the knife in his pocket with a sigh. "I guess Will Morrison wouldn't like it," he decided. "Put up your money, Sary." Sarah withdrew the gold piece and put a larger one in its place. "There," she said. "Let's make it $10 and save time." Bub's hesitation vanished, but he asked anxiously: "'Tain't goin' to do no harm to them gals that's stoppin' here, is it?" "It's to do them a good turn that I'm sending this telegram." "Honour bright?" "Hope to die, Bub." "All right, I'm off." He folded the letter, placed it inside his Scotch cap and stowed the money carefully in his pocket. "Don't let any of the folks see you if you can help it," warned Sarah, "and whatever happens, don't say anything about that telegram to a living soul. Only see that it's sent." "I'm wise," answered Bub, and a moment later he started the car and rolled away down the road. Sarah Judd looked after him with a queer smile on her face. Then she went back to her kitchen and resumed her dishwashing. Presently a scarcely audible sound arrested her attention. It seemed to come from the interior of the lodge. Sarah avoided making a particle of noise herself as she stole softly through the dining room and entered the main hallway. One glance showed her that the front door was ajar and the door of the den closed, exactly the reverse of what they should be. She crept forward and with a sudden movement threw open the door of the room. A woman stood in the center of the room. As the door opened she swung around and pointed a revolver at Sarah. Then for a moment they silently faced one another. "Ah," said the woman with an accent of relief, "you're the servant. Go back to your work. Mrs. Conant told me to make myself at home here." "Yes, I know," replied Sarah sarcastically. "She said she was expecting you and told me it wouldn't do any harm to keep an eye on you while you're here. She said Miss Lord was going to get all the family away, so you could make a careful search of the house, you being Miss Lord's maid, Susan, otherwise known as Nan Shelley, from the Washington bureau." Susan's hands shook so ridiculously that she lowered the revolver to prevent its dropping from her grasp. Her countenance expressed chagrin, surprise, anger. "I don't know you," she said harshly. "Who are you?" "New at the game," replied Sarah Judd with a shrug. "You don't know me, Nan, but I know you, and I know your record, too. You're as slick as they make 'em, and the one who calls herself Agatha Lord is just an infantile amateur beside you. But go ahead, Nan. Don't let me interrupt your work." The woman sank into a chair. "You can't be from the Home Office," she muttered, staring hard at the girl. "They wouldn't dare interfere with my work here." "No, I'm not from the Home Office." "I knew," said Susan, "as soon as I heard the story of your coming, that it was faked. I'd gamble that you never saw Mrs. Morrison in your life." "You'd win," said Sarah, also taking a chair. "Then who could have sent you here?" "Figure it out yourself," suggested Sarah. "I'm trying to. Do you know what we're after?" "A clue to Hathaway. Incidentally, any other information concerning him that comes your way. That includes the letter." "Oh, so you know about the letter, do you?" asked Susan. "To be sure. And I know that's what you're here for now. Don't let me interrupt you. It's a mighty hard job finding that letter, and the folks'll be back by and by." "You're right," exclaimed the woman, rising abruptly. "Go back to your work in the kitchen." "This is my occupation just now," retorted Sarah, lolling in her chair. "Go ahead with your search, Nan. I'll tell you when you are hot or cold." "You're an impudent little chit," said Nan tartly. "See here," with a sudden change of voice, "let's pool issues. If we can discover anything important in this place, there's reward enough for us all." "I am not opposing you," protested Sarah Judd. "I'm not a particle interested in whether you trace Hathaway or not. I don't believe you can do it, though, and that letter you're so eager for won't help you a bit. It was written 10 years ago." "That makes it more important," declared the other. "We've two things to accomplish. One is to locate Hathaway, and the other to secure absolute proof of his guilt." "I thought he was caught doing the job." "So he was, in a way, but the department needs more proof." Sarah Judd smiled unbelievingly. Then she chuckled. Presently she laughed outright in genuine merriment, as the thought that amused her grew and expanded. "What fools," she said, "what perfect fools we mortals be!" All this annoyed Nan Shelley exceedingly. The successful woman detective did not relish being jeered at by a mere girl. "You've read the letter, I suppose, and are now making fun of me for trying to get it. Perhaps you've hidden it yourself, although that isn't likely. Why can't you give me an honest tip? We're both in the same line, it seems, and both trying to earn an honest living. How about that letter? Is it necessary for me to find it?" "I've read it," admitted Sarah, "and I know where it is. You might perhaps find it if you hunted long enough, but it isn't worth your while. It wouldn't help in the least to convict Hathaway, and of course it couldn't tell you where he is now hiding." "Is this straight?" "True as gospel." "Then why don't you prove it by showing me the letter?" "Because I don't belong on your side of the fence. You're working for one organization and I for another. Any little tip I let slip is just for your personal use. Don't bother about that letter." Susan, or Nan Shelley, sat for a time in thought. Once in a while she would cast a furtive glance around the room and its wall covered with trophies, and then she would turn to Sarah Judd's placid face. "Where did the boy go?" she asked abruptly. "What boy?" "Bub, in the automobile." "To Millbank." "What for?" "To send a telegram. Your report?" "Yes." "Important?" "I think it'll bring things to a climax." "The Hathaway case?" "You can guess anything, Nan, if you guess long enough." Nan rose and put the revolver in her pocket. Then she held out her hand frankly to Sarah Judd. "If you've beaten me in this affair," she said, with no apparent resentment, "you're clever enough to become famous some day. I'm going to take your advice about the letter, and if that climax you're predicting arrives on scheduled time I'll not be sorry to quit this dreary, dragging case and pick up a more interesting one." The tone was friendly and frank. Sarah stretched out her hand to meet that of Nan, and in a flash a handcuff snapped over her wrist. With a cry she drew back, but a dexterous twist of her opponent's free hand prisoned her other wrist, and she at once realized that she was fairly caught. "Fine!" she cried admiringly, as she looked at her bonds. "What next, Nan?" But Nan was too busy to talk. She deftly searched the girl's pocket and found the notebook. The shorthand writing caught her eye at once, but the characters were unknown to her. "Cipher, eh?" she muttered. "A little code of my own invention," said Sarah. "Sometimes I can't make it out myself." Nan restored the book and examined Sarah Judd's purse. "They keep you well supplied with funds, it seems." "Comes in handy in emergencies," was the reply. "Now let's go to your room." Sarah, handcuffed, led the way. Nan Shelley made a wonderfully rapid search through every article in the maid's room. The lining of her clothes was inspected, her hair brush tested for a sliding back, the pictures on the wall, the rug and the bedclothing examined minutely. Yet all this consumed but a brief period of time and resulted in no important discovery. "Feel better?" asked Sarah cheerfully. "You know I do. I'm going to remove these handcuffs now, and then I'm going home. Come and see me, some time, when you feel lonesome. I've only that fool Agatha to talk to, and I've an idea you and I might interest each other." As she spoke she unlocked the manacles, and dropped them with a slight click into a concealed pocket of her dark skirt. "I imagine Agatha isn't real brilliant," returned Sarah, "but neither am I. When I'm your age, Nan, I hope to be half as clever. Just now you can twist me round your finger." Nan regarded her seriously. "I wish I knew what you were up to," she remarked suspiciously. "You can scarcely conceal your joy, my girl, and that proves I've overlooked something. You've puzzled me, youngster as you are, but you must remember that I'm working in the dark, while some mysterious gleam of knowledge lights your way. Put us side by side on the same track, and I wouldn't be afraid of you, Sarah Judd." "Don't apologize, Nan. It makes me feel ashamed." Nan's frown, as she looked into the blue eyes, turned into a smile of appreciation. Sarah also smiled, and then she said, "Let me make you a cup of tea before you go." "A good idea. We're friends, then?" "Why not? One friend is worth 1,000 enemies, and it's absurd to quarrel with one for doing her duty." "That's what O'Gorman is always saying. Ever hear of O'Gorman?" "Yes. He's one of the old stand-bys in the Secret Service Department, but they say he's getting old. Slipped a good many cogs lately, I hear." "He's the Chief's right-hand man. O'Gorman used to have this case, the branch of it I'm now working, but he gave it up and recommended the Chief to put me on the job." Said a woman could trail Mary Louise better than any man, and with less chance of discovery, and he was right, for I've lived half a block from her in Dorfield and she never saw my face once. But O'Gorman didn't suspect you were coming into the case, and the thing's getting altogether too complicated to suit me." Sarah was brewing the tea and considered an answer unnecessary. The conversation drifted away from the Hathaway case and into less personal channels. When Nan Shelley finally rose to go there was sincere friendliness in Sarah's good-bye, and the elder woman said in parting, "You're the right sort, Sarah. If you ever drift into Washington and need work, come to me and I'll get the chief to take you on. I know he'd be glad to get you." "Thank you, Nan," said Sarah meekly. But there was a smile on her freckled face as she watched her recent acquaintance walk down the road, and it lingered there while she returned to her kitchen, and finally washed and put away the long-neglected lunch-dishes. Bub dashed into the yard and tooted his horn. Sarah went out to him. "You can call me lucky if you don't mind," he said with a grin. "Sent your telegram, found out the tenner you give me were good, and got back without the folks gettin' a single blink at me. You're some driver, Bub, and you've got a wise head on your shoulders. If you don't talk about this trip, and I don't, no one will ever know, except we two, that the car has been out of the garage." End of Chapter 20. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 21 of Mary Louise by L. Frank Baum. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 21. Bad News. Peter Conant had told his wife that he wouldn't be at the lodge this week until Saturday, as business would prevent his coming earlier. Yet the Thursday afternoon train brought him to Millbank, and Bill Coombs's stage took him to Hillcrest. "Why, Peter!" exclaimed Aunt Hannah when she saw him. "What on earth brought you—" Then she stopped short, for Peter's eyes were staring more roundly than usual, and the hand that fumbled at his locket trembled visibly. He stared at Aunt Hannah, he stared at Irene, but most of all he stared at Mary Louise, who seemed to sense from his manner some impending misfortune. Said the lawyer, growing red and then paling. "I've bad news." He chopped the words off abruptly, as if he resented the necessity of uttering them. His eyes, which had been fixed upon the face of Mary Louise, suddenly wavered and sought the floor. His manner said more than his words. Mary Louise grew white and pressed her hands to her heart, regarding the lawyer with eyes questioning and full of fear. Irene turned a sympathetic gaze upon her friend, and Aunt Hannah came closer to the girl, and slipped an arm around her waist, as if to help her to endure this unknown trial. And Mary Louise, feeling she could not bear the suspense, asked falteringly, "Has Grandpa Jim been—" "No," said Mr. Conant. "No, my dear, no." "Then, has anything happened to Mother?" "Well, well," muttered the lawyer with a sort of growl. "Mrs. Burroughs has not been in good health for some months, it seems. She was under a nervous strain, a severe nervous strain, you know, and—" "Is she dead?" asked the girl in a low, hard voice. "The end, it seems, came unexpectedly several days ago. She did not suffer, your grandfather writes, but—" Again he left his sentence unfinished, for Mary Louise had buried her face in Aunt Hannah's bosom, and was sobbing in a miserable, heart-breaking way that made Peter jerk a handkerchief from his pocket, and blow his nose lustily. Then he turned and marched from the room, while his wife led the hapless girl to a sofa, and cuddled her in her lap as if she had been a little child. "She's best with the women," muttered Peter to himself. "It's a sorrowful thing, a dreadful thing, in a way, but it can't be helped, and she's best with the women." He had wandered into the dining-room, where Sarah Judd was laying the table for dinner. She must have overheard the conversation in the living-room, for she came beside the lawyer and asked, "When did Mrs. Burroughs die?" "On Monday." "Where?" "That's none of your business, my girl." "Has the funeral been held?" He regarded her curiously. The idea of a servant asking such questions! But there was a look in Sarah's blue eyes that meant more than curiosity; somehow it drew from him an answer. Mrs. Burroughs was cremated on Wednesday. It seems she preferred it to burial. Having said this, he turned to stare from the window again. Sarah Judd stood silent a moment. Then she said, with a sigh of relief, "It's a queer world, isn't it, Mr. Conant? And this death isn't altogether a calamity." "Eh? Why not?" whirling around to face her. "Because," said Sarah, "it will enable Mr. Hathaway to face the world again, a free man." Peter Conant was so startled that he stood motionless, forgetting his locket but not forgetting to stare. Sarah, with her hands full of forks and spoons, began placing the silver in orderly array upon the table. She paid no heed to the lawyer, who gradually recovered his poise and watched her with newly awakened interest. Once or twice he opened his mouth to speak, and then decided not to. He was bewildered, perplexed, suspicious. In thought he began to review the manner of Sarah's coming to them, and her subsequent actions. She seemed a capable servant. Mrs. Conant had never complained of her. Yet what did she know of Hathaway? Mary Louise did not appear at dinner. She begged to be left alone in her room. Sarah took her some toast and tea, with honest sympathy in her eyes, but the sorrowing girl shook her head and would not taste the food. Later, however, in the evening, she entered the living room where the others sat in depressed silence and said, "Please, Mr. Conant, tell me all you know about Mother." "It is very little, my dear," replied the lawyer in a kindly tone. "This morning I received a message from your grandfather which said, 'Poor Beatrice passed away on Monday, and at her request her body was cremated to-day. Be very gentle in breaking the sad news to Mary Louise.' That was all, my child, and I came here as quickly as I could. In a day or so we shall have further details, I feel sure. I am going back to town in the morning, and will send you any information I receive." "Thank you," said the girl, and was quietly leaving the room when Irene called to her, "Mary Louise!" "Yes," half turning. "Will you come with me to my room?" "Now?" "Yes. You know I cannot go up the stairs. And I lost my own dear mother not long ago, you will remember." Tears started to the girl's eyes, but she waited until Irene wheeled her chair beside her, and then the two went through the den to Irene's room. Mrs. Conant nodded to Peter approvingly. "Irene will comfort her," she said, "and in a far better way than I might do. It is all very dreadful and very sad, Peter, but the poor child has never enjoyed much of her mother's society, and when the first bitter grief is past, I think she will recover something of her usual cheerfulness." Returned the lawyer. "It seems a hard thing to say, Hannah, but this demise may prove a blessing in disguise, and be best for the child's future happiness. In any event, I'm sure it will relieve the strain many of us have been under for the past 10 years." "You talk in riddles, Peter." "The whole thing is a riddle, Hannah. And, by the way, have you noticed anything suspicious about our hired girl?" "About Sarah? No," regarding him with surprise. "Does she snoop around much?" "No, she's a very good girl." "Too good to be true, perhaps," observed Peter, and lapsed into thought. Really, it wouldn't matter how much Sarah Judd or anyone else knew of the Hathaway case. The mystery would solve itself presently. End of Chapter 21. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Of Mary Louise by L. Frank Baum. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 22. The Folks at Bigby's. Mr. Conant decided to take the Friday morning train back to Dorfield, saying it would not be possible for him to remain at the lodge over Sunday, because important business might require his presence in town. "This demise of Mrs. Burrows," he said confidentially to his wife in the privacy of their room, "may have far-reaching results, and turn the whole current of Colonel Weatherby's life." "I don't see why," said Aunt Hannah. "You're not expected to see why," he replied. "As the Colonel is my most important client, I must be at the office in case of developments or a sudden demand for my services. I will tell you one thing, however, and that is that this vacation at Hillcrest Lodge was planned by the Colonel while I was in New York, with the idea that he and Mrs. Burrows would come here secretly and enjoy a nice visit with Mary Louise." "You planned all that, Peter?" "Yes, that is, Weatherby planned it. He knows Will Morrison well, and Will was only too glad to assist him. So they wired me to come to New York, where all was quickly arranged. This place is so retired that we considered it quite safe for the fugitives to come here." "Why didn't they come, then?" "Two reasons prevented them. One was the sudden breaking of Mrs. Burrows' health. The other reason was the Colonel's discovery that in some way our carefully laid plans had become known to the detectives who are seeking him." "Good gracious! Are you sure of that, Peter?" "The Colonel seems sure. He maintains a detective force on his own account, and his spies discovered that Hillcrest is being watched by agents of the Secret Service." "Dear me, what a maze of deceit!" wailed the good woman. "I wish you were well out of the whole affair, Peter, and I wish Mary Louise was out of it, too." "So do I, with all my heart. But it's coming to a focus soon, Hannah. Be patient, and it may end better than we now fear." So Bub drove Mr. Conant to Millbank, and then the boy took the car to the blacksmith's shop to have a small part repaired. The blacksmith made such a bungle of it, and wasted all the forenoon, before he finally took Bub's advice about shaping it, and the new rod was attached and found to work successfully. It was after 1 o'clock when the boy at last started for home, and on the way was hailed by a stranger, a little man who was trudging along the road with both hands thrust in his pockets. "Going far?" he asked. "Up the mountain to Hillcrest," said Bub. "Oh, may I have a lift?" "How fur?" "Well, I can't say how far I'll go. I'm undecided. Just came out here for a little fresh air, you know, with no definite plans," explained the stranger. "Hop in," said Bub, and for a time they rode together in silence. "This here's the Huddle, as we's comin' to," announced the boy. "Ol' Mis' Parsons she sometimes takes boarders." "That's kind of her," remarked the stranger, "but the air isn't so good as further up the hill." "If ye go up," said Bub with a grin, "I guess you'll have to camp out and eat scrub. Nobody don't take boarders up the mountain." "I suppose not." He made no demand to be let out at the Huddle, so Bub drove on. "By the way," said the little man, "isn't there a place called Bigby's near here?" "Coming to it pretty soon. They's some gals livin' there now, so ye won't care to stop." "What sort of girls are they?" "Sort o' queer." "Yes?" "You betcha. Come from the city a while ago an' livin' by themselves. Somethin' wrong about them girls," added Bub, reflectively. "In what way?" asked the little man, in a tone of interest. "They ain't here for nothin' special 'cept watchin' the folks at Hillcrest. Them's the folks I belongs to 4 bits a week. They's somethin' queer about them, too, but I guess all the folks is queer that comes out here from the city." "Quite likely," agreed the little man, nodding. "Let me out at Bigby's, please, and I'll look over those women and form my own opinion of them. They may perhaps be friends of mine." "In that case," asserted Bub, "I pity ye, stranger. For my part, I ain't got no use for anythin' that wears a skirt. 'Cept 1 or 2, maybe," he added reflectively. "Most men I kin git along with, frustrate, but if a man ever gits in trouble, or begins cussin' an' acts ugly, it's 'cause some gal's rubbed him crosswise the grain or stuck a knife in him an' twisted the blade, so's to speak." "You're an observant lad, I see." "When I'm awake I can't help seein' things." "And you're a pastoral philosopher." Bub scowled and gave him a surly glance. "What's the use firin' that highbrow stuff at me?" he asked, indignantly. "I s'pose you think I'm a kid, just 'cause I don't do no fancy talkin'." "I suspect you of nothing but generosity in giving me this ride," said the stranger pleasantly. "Is that Bigby's over yonder?" "Yes." The little man got out at the point where the Bigby drive met the road, and walked up the drive toward the house. Agatha Lord was standing at the gateway, as he approached it, and seemed rather startled at his appearance. But she quickly controlled her surprise, and asked in a calm voice, as she faced him, "What's up, O'Gorman?" "Hathaway's coming here," he said. "Are you sure?" "He's in Dorfield to day, waiting to see Lawyer Conant, who went in on the morning train. Where's Nan?" "Here, my lord," said Nan Shelley, stepping from behind a tall shrub. "How are you, partner? I recognized you as you passed the Huddle with the boy." "Field glasses, eh? There isn't much escapes you, Nan." "Why didn't you tell me?" asked Agatha, reproachfully. "Why don't you make your own discoveries?" retorted her confederate. Then, turning to O'Gorman, she continued: "So Hathaway's coming here, is he? At last." "A little late, but according to programme. How have you been getting along?" "Bored to death," asserted Nan. "Agatha has played the lady, and I've done the dirty work. But tell me, why didn't you nab Hathaway at Dorfield?" O'Gorman smiled a little grimly as he answered: "I'm not sure, Nan, that we shall nab Hathaway at all." "Isn't he being shadowed?" with some surprise. "No, but he'll come up here, right enough, and then," she added, as he paused, "the chase of years will come to an end." "Exactly. We may decide to take him to Washington, and we may not." She gazed at him inquiringly. "There are some new developments, then, O'Gorman?" "I'm inclined to suspect there are." "Known to the Department?" "Yes. I'm to investigate and use my judgment." "I see. Then Agatha and I are out of it?" "Not yet. I'm still depending on your shrewdness to assist me. The office has only had a hint, so far, of the prospective break in the case, but—" "Oh, yes, I remember now," exclaimed Nan. "That girl up at Conant sent a telegram in a desperate hurry. I suspected it meant something important. Who is she, O'Gorman, and why did the Chief cut under us by planting Sarah Judd in the Conant's household?" "He didn't. The girl has nothing to do with the Department." "Then some of you intercepted the telegram?" "We know what it said," he admitted. "Come, let's go to the house. I've had no lunch. Can you feed me?" "Certainly." They turned and walked slowly up the path. Said Nan, musingly: That Sarah Judd is rather clever, O'Gorman. Is she in Hathaway's pay?" "I think not," he replied, with an amused chuckle. Nan tossed her head indignantly. "Very well, play me for a ninny if you like," she said resentfully. "You'll get a heap more out of me in that way." Now," said Agatha warningly. "Keep your tempers and don't quarrel. You two are like cats and dogs when you get together, yet you're the two cleverest people in the service. According to your story, Mr. O'Gorman, there's an important crisis approaching, and we'd all like to be able to render a good account of ourselves." Agatha Lord may have lacked something of Nan's experience, but this speech proved her a fair diplomat. It dispersed the gathering storm and during the rest of that afternoon the three counselled together in perfect harmony, O'Gorman confiding to his associates such information as would enable them to act with him intelligently. Hathaway and Peter Conant could not arrive till the next day at noon; they might even come by the afternoon train. Nan's field glasses would warn them of the arrival, and meanwhile there was ample time to consider how they should act. Chapter 23. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 23 of Mary Louise by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 23. A Kiss from Josie. That evening, as Sarah Judd was sitting in her room reading a book, her work for the day being over, she heard a succession of little taps against her window pane. She sat still, listening, until the taps were repeated, when she walked straight to the window and through-tipped the sash. O'Gorman's face appeared in the opening, and the girl put a hand on each of his cheeks and, leaning over, kissed him full upon his lips. The man's face, lighted by the lamp from within the room, was radiant. Even the fat nose was beatified by the love that shone in his small grey eyes. He took one of her hands in both of his and held it close a moment, while they regarded each other silently. Then he gave a little beckoning signal, and the girl turned to slip on a light coat, for the nights were chill on the mountain. Afterwards, she unfastened her outside door and joined the detective, who passed an arm around her and led her to one of the benches on the bluff. The new moon was dim, but a sprinkling of stars lit the sky. The man and girl were far enough from the lodge not to be overheard. "It's good to see you again, Josie," said O'Gorman as they seated themselves on the bench. "How do you like being a sleuth?" "Really, Daddy," she replied, "it has been no end of a lark. I'm dead sick of washing other folks' dishes, I confess, but the fun I've had has more than made up for the hard work. Do you know, Dad, I had a session with Nan Shelley one day, and she didn't have much the best of it, either, although she's quick as a cat and had me backed off the map in every way except for the matter of wits. My thoughts didn't crumble much, and Nan was good enough to congratulate me. She knew, as soon as I did, about the letter the crippled girl found in a book, but I managed to make a copy of it, while Nan is still wondering where it is hid. I'm patting myself on the back, Dad, because you trained me, and I want to prove myself a credit to your training. It's no wonder, with such a master, that I could hold my own with Nan Shelley." He gave a little amused laugh. "You're all right, Josie dear," he replied. "My training wouldn't have amounted to shucks if you hadn't possessed the proper grey matter to work with. But about that letter," more seriously, "your telegram told me a lot, because our code is so concise, but also left a good deal to be guessed at. Who wrote the letter? I must know all the details in order to understand it properly." "It's all down in my private shorthand book," said Josie O'Gorman, "but I've never dared to make a clear copy while Nan was so near me. You can't read it, Dad, and I can't read it to you in the dark, so you'll have to wait." "Have you your notebook here?" "Always carry it." He drew an electric storage lamp from his pocket and shielded the tiny circle of light with his coat. "Now then," he said, "read the letter to me, Josie. It's impossible for anyone to see the light from the house." The girl held her notebook behind the flap of his coat, where the lamp shed its white rays upon it, and slowly read the text of the letter. O'Gorman sat silent for some time after she had finished reading. "In all my speculations concerning the Hathaway case," he said to his daughter, "I never guessed this is the true solution of the man's extraordinary actions. But now, realizing that Hathaway is a gentleman to the core, I understand he could not have acted in any other way." "Mrs. Burrows is dead," remarked Josie. "I know. It's a pity she didn't die long ago." "This thing killed her, Dad." "I'm sure of it. She was a weak, though kind-hearted woman, and this trouble wore her out with fear and anxiety. How did the girl, Mary Louise, take her mother's death?" "Rather hard, at first. She's quieter now. But see here, Dad, are you still working for the department?" "Of course." "Then I'm sorry I've told you so much. I'm on the other side. I'm here to protect Mary Louise Burrows and her interests." "To be sure. I sent you here myself at my own expense, both to test your training before I let you into the regular game and for the sake of the little Burrows girl, whom I fell in love with when she was so friendless. I believed things would reach a climax in the Hathaway case, in this very spot, but I couldn't foresee that your cleverness would ferret out that letter, which the girl Irene intended to keep silent about, nor did I know that the chief would send me here in person to supervise Hathaway's capture. Mighty queer things happen in this profession of ours, and circumstances lead the best of us by the nose." "Do you intend to arrest Mr. Hathaway?" "After hearing that letter read, and in view of the fact that Mrs. Burrows is dead, I think not. The letter, if authentic, clears up the mystery to our complete satisfaction. But I must get the story from Hathaway's own lips, and then compare his statement with that in the letter. If they agree, we won't prosecute the man at all, and the famous case that has caused us so much trouble for years will be filed in the office pigeonholes and pass into ancient history." Josie O'Gorman sat silent for a long time. Then she asked: "Do you think Mr. Hathaway will come here, now that "I'm quite sure he will come." "When?" "Tomorrow." "Then I must warn them and try to head him off. I'm on his side, Dad, don't forget that." "I won't, and because you're on his side, Josie, you must let him come and be vindicated, and so clear up this matter for good and all." "Poor Mary Louise! I was thinking of her, not of her grandfather. Have you considered how a knowledge of the truth will affect her?" "Yes. She will be the chief sufferer when her grandfather's innocence is finally proved." "It will break her heart," said Josie with a sigh. "Perhaps not. She's mighty fond of her grandfather. She'll be glad to have him freed from suspicion, and she'll be sorry about the other thing." Sarah Judd, otherwise Josie O'Gorman, sighed again, but presently she gave a little chuckle of glee. "Won't Nan be wild, though, when she finds I've beaten her and won the case for Hathaway?" "Nan won't mind. She's an old hand at the game, and has learned to take things as they come. She'll be at work upon some other case within a week, and will have forgotten that this one ever bothered her." "Who is Agatha Lord, and why did they send her here as principal, with Nan as her maid?" "Agatha is an educated woman who has moved in good society. The chief thought she would be more likely to gain the friendship of the Conants than Nan, for poor Nan hasn't much breeding to boast of. But she was really the principal for all that, and Agatha was instructed to report to her, and to take her orders." "They were both suspicious of me," said the girl, "but as neither of them had ever set eyes on me before, I was able to puzzle them. On the other hand, I knew who Nan was because I'd seen her with you, which gave me an advantage. Now, tell me, how's Mother?" "Pretty chirky, but anxious about you because this is your first case, and she feared your judgment wasn't sufficiently matured. I told her you'd pull through all right." For an hour they sat talking together, then Officer O'Gorman kissed his daughter good night and walked back to the Bigby house. End of Chapter 23. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Louise by L. Frank Baum. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 24. Facing the Truth. Irene was a great comfort to Mary Louise in this hour of trial. The chair girl, beneath her gaiety of demeanour and lightness of speech, was deeply religious. Her absolute faith sounded so cheering that death was robbed of much of its horror, and her bereaved friend found solace. Mary Louise was able to talk freely of Mamma B. to Irene, while with Aunt Hannah she rather avoided reference to her mother. "I've always longed to be more with Mamma B. and to learn and to know her better," she said to her friend, "for though she was very loving and gentle to me while I was with her, she spent most of her life caring for Gran'pa Jim, and they were away from me so much that I really didn't get to know Mamma very well. I think she worried a good deal over Gran'pa's troubles. She couldn't help that, of course, but I always hoped that some day the troubles would be over, and we could all live happily together. And now that can never be." Irene, knowing more of the Hathaway family history than Mary Louise did, through the letters she had found and read, was often perplexed how to console her friend and still regard honesty and truth. Any deception, even when practised through the best of motives, was abhorrent to her nature, so she avoided speaking of the present affliction, and led Mary Louise to look to a future life for the motherly companionship she had missed on earth. "That," said she, "is the thought that has always given me the most comfort. We are both orphans, dear, and I'm sure your nature is as brave as my own, and that you can bear equally well the loss of your parents." And Mary Louise was really brave, and tried hard to bear her grief with patient resignation. One thing she presently decided in her mind, although she did not mention it to Irene. She must find Grandpa Jim, and go to him, wherever he might be. Grandpa Jim and her mother had been inseparable companions. Mary Louise knew that her own present sorrow could be nothing when compared to that of her grandfather. And so it was her duty to find him and comfort him, to devote her whole life, as her mother had done, to caring for his wants and cheering his loneliness, so far indeed as she was able to do. Of course, no one could quite take the place of Mamma B. She was thinking in this vein as she sat in the den with Irene that Saturday afternoon. The chair girl, who sewed beautifully, was fixing over one of Mary Louise's black dresses, while Mary Louise sat opposite, listlessly watching her. The door into the hall was closed, but the glass door to the rear porch was wide open to let in the sun and air. And this simple scene was the setting for the drama about to be enacted. Mary Louise had her back half turned to the hall door, which Irene partially faced, and so it was that when the door opened softly and the chair girl raised her head to gaze with startled surprise at someone who stood in the doorway, Mary Louise first curiously eyed her friend's expressive face, and then, rather languidly, turned her head to glance over her shoulder. The next moment she sprang to her feet and rushed forward. "Grandpa Jim! Oh, Grandpa Jim!" she cried, and threw herself into the arms of a tall man, who folded her to his breast in a close embrace. For a while they stood there silent, while Irene dropped her eyes to her lap, deeming the reunion too sacred to be observed by another. And then a little stir at the open porch door attracted her attention, and with a shock of repulsion she saw Agatha Lord standing there with a cynical smile on her lovely face. Softly, the sash of the window was raised, and the maid Susan stood on the ground outside, leaned her elbows on the sill, and quietly regarded the scene within the den. The opening of the window arrested Colonel Weatherby's attention. He lifted his head, and with a quick glance took in the situation. Then, still holding his granddaughter in his arms, he advanced to the centre of the room and said sternly, addressing Agatha, "Is this a deliberate intrusion, because I am here, or is it pure insolence?" "Forgive us if we intrude, Mr. Hathaway," replied Agatha. "It was not our desire to interrupt your meeting with your granddaughter, but it has been so difficult in the past to secure an interview with you, sir, that we dared not risk missing you at this time." He regarded her with an expression of astonishment. "That's it exactly, Mr. Weatherby Hathaway," remarked Susan mockingly from her window. "Don't pay any attention to them, Grandpa Jim," begged Mary Louise, clinging to him. "They're just two dreadful women who live down below here, and "I realize who they are," said the old gentleman in a calm voice, and addressing Agatha again he continued, "Since you are determined to interview me, pray step inside and be seated." Agatha shook her head with a smile. Nan Shelley laughed outright and retorted, "Not yet, Hathaway. We can't afford to take chances with one who has dodged the whole department for 10 years. Then you are government agents?" he asked. "That's it, sir." He turned his head toward the door by which he had entered, for there was an altercation going on in the hallway, and Mr. Conant's voice could be heard angrily protesting. A moment later the lawyer came in, followed by the little man with the fat nose, who bowed to Colonel Weatherby very respectfully, yet remained planted in the doorway. "This is very unfortunate, sir, very unfortunate," exclaimed Peter Conant, chopping off each word with a sort of snarl. "These confounded Secret Service people have trailed us here." "It doesn't matter, Mr. Conant," replied the Colonel in a voice composed but very weary. He seated himself in a chair, as he spoke, and Mary Louise sat on the arm of it, still embracing him. "No," said O'Gorman, "it really doesn't matter, sir. In fact, I'm sure you will feel relieved to have this affair off your mind, and be spared all further annoyance concerning it." The old gentleman looked at him steadily, but made no answer. It was Peter Conant who faced the speaker and demanded, "What do you mean by that statement?" "Mr. Hathaway knows what I mean. He can, in a few words, explain why he has for years borne the accusation of a crime of which he is innocent." Peter Conant was so astounded he could do nothing but stare at the detective. Staring was the very best thing that Peter did, and he never stared harder in his life. The tears had been coursing down Mary Louise's cheeks, but now a glad look crossed her face. "Do you hear that, Grandpa Jim?" she cried. "Of course you are innocent. I've always known that, but now even your enemies do." Mr. Hathaway looked long into the girl's eyes, which met his own hopefully, almost joyfully. Then he turned to O'Gorman. I cannot prove my innocence," he said. "Do you mean that you will not?" "I will go with you and stand my trial. I will accept whatever punishment the law decrees." O'Gorman nodded his head. "I know exactly how you feel about it, Mr. Hathaway," he said, "and I sympathize with you most earnestly. Will you allow me to sit down a while? Thank you." He took a chair facing that of the hunted man. Agatha, seeing this, seated herself on the doorstep. Nan maintained her position, leaning through the open window. "This," said O'Gorman, "is a strange case. It has always been a strange case, sir, from the very beginning. Important government secrets of the United States were stolen and turned over to the agent of a foreign government, which is none too friendly to our own. It was considered, in its day, one of the most traitorous crimes in our history. And you, sir, a citizen of high standing and repute, were detected in the act of transferring many of these important papers to a spy, thus perilling the safety of the nation. You were caught red-handed, so to speak, but made your escape in a manner remarkable, and even wonderful for its adroitness, and have for years evaded every effort on the part of our Secret Service Department to effect your capture. And yet, despite the absolute truth of this statement, you are innocent." No one cared to reply for a time. Some who had listened to O'Gorman were too startled to speak; others refrained. Mary Louise stared at the detective with almost Peter Conant's expression, her eyes big and round. Irene thrilled with joyous anticipation, for in the presence of this sorrowing, hunted, white-haired old man, whose years had been devoted to patient self-sacrifice, the humiliation the coming disclosure would thrust upon Mary Louise seemed now insignificant. Until this moment, Irene had been determined to suppress the knowledge gained through the old letter, in order to protect the feelings of her friend, but now a crying need for the truth to prevail was borne in upon her. She had thought that she alone knew the truth. To her astonishment, as well as satisfaction, the chair girl now discovered that O'Gorman was equally well informed. End of Chapter 24. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Of Mary Louise by L. Frank Baum. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 25. Simple Justice. All eyes were turned upon Mr. Hathaway, who had laid a hand upon the head of his grandchild and was softly stroking her hair. At last he said, brokenly, repeating his former assertion, "I cannot prove my innocence." "But I can," declared O'Gorman positively, "and I'm going to do it." "No, no!" said Hathaway, startled at his tone. "It's this way, sir," explained the little man in a matter-of-fact voice. "This chase after you has cost the government a heavy sum already, and your prosecution is likely to make public an affair which, under the circumstances, we consider it more diplomatic to hush up. Any danger to our country has passed, for information obtained 10 years ago regarding our defenses, codes, and the like, is today worthless, because all conditions are completely changed. Only the crime of treason remains, a crime that deserves the severest punishment, but the guilty persons have escaped punishment and are now facing a higher tribunal, both the principal in this crime and his weak and foolish tool. So it is best for all concerned, Mr. Hathaway, that we get at the truth of this matter, and when it is clearly on record in the government files, declare the case closed for all time. The State Department has more important matters that demand its attention." The old man's head was bowed, his chin resting on his breast. It was now the turn of Mary Louise to smooth his thin grey cheeks. "If you will make a statement, sir," continued O'Gorman, "we shall be able to verify it." Slowly Hathaway raised his head. "I have no statement to make," he persisted. "This is rank folly!" exclaimed O'Gorman. "But if you refuse to make the statement I shall make it myself." "I beg you, I implore you," said Hathaway pleadingly. The detective rose and stood before him, looking not at the old man but at the young girl, Mary Louise. "Tell me, my child," he said gently, "would you not rather see your grandfather, an honourable, high-minded gentleman, acquitted of an unjust accusation, even at the expense of some abasement and perhaps heartaches on your part, rather than allow him to continue to suffer disgrace in order to shield you from so slight an affliction?" "Sir!" cried Hathaway indignantly, starting to his feet, "how dare you throw the burden on this poor child? Have you no mercy, no compassion?" "Plenty," was the quiet reply. "Sit down, sir. This girl is stronger than you think. She will not be made permanently unhappy by knowing the truth, I assure you." Hathaway regarded him with a look of anguish akin to fear. Then he turned and seated himself, again putting an arm around Mary Louise as if to shield her. Said Irene, speaking very slowly. "I am quite sure Mr. O'Gorman is right. Mary Louise is a brave girl, and she loves her grandfather." Then Mary Louise spoke, hesitatingly at first, for she could not yet comprehend the full import of the officer's words. "If you mean," said she, "that it will cause me sorrow and humiliation to free my grandfather from suspicion, and that he refuses to speak because he fears the truth will hurt me, then I ask you to speak out, Mr. O'Gorman." "Of course," returned the little man, smiling at her approvingly. "That is just what I intend to do. All these years, my girl, your grandfather has accepted reproach and disgrace in order to shield the good name of a woman and save her from a prison cell. And that woman was your mother." "Oh!" cried Mary Louise, and covered her face with her hands. "You brute!" exclaimed Hathaway, highly incensed. "But this is not all," continued O'Gorman, unmoved. "Your mother, Mary Louise, would have been condemned and imprisoned, and deservedly so in the eyes of the law, had the truth been known, and yet I assure you she was only guilty of folly and of ignorance of the terrible consequences that might have resulted from her act. She was weak enough to be loyal to a promise wrung from her in extremity, and therein lay her only fault. Your grandfather knew all this, and she was his daughter, his only child. When the accusation for your mother's crime fell on him, he ran away and so tacitly admitted his guilt, thus drawing suspicion from her. His reason for remaining hidden was that, had he been caught and brought to trial, he could not have lied or perjured himself under oath, even to save his dearly loved daughter from punishment. Now you understand why he could not submit to arrest, why, assisted by a small but powerful band of faithful friends, he has been able to evade capture during all these years. I admire him for that, but he has sacrificed himself long enough. Your mother's recent death renders her prosecution impossible. It is time the truth prevailed. In simple justice I will not allow this old man to embitter further his life, just to protect his grandchild from a knowledge of her mother's sin." Again a deathly silence pervaded the room. You are speaking at random," said Hathaway, in a voice choked with emotion. "You have no proof of these dreadful statements." "But I have," said Irene bravely, believing it her duty to support O'Gorman. "And so have I," asserted the quiet voice of Sarah Judd, who had entered the room unperceived. Hathaway regarded both the girls in surprise, but said nothing. "I think," said Officer O'Gorman, "it will be best for us to read to Mr. Hathaway that letter." "The letter which I found in the book?" asked Irene eagerly. "Yes, but do not disturb yourself," as she started to wheel her chair close to the wall. "Josie will get it." To Irene's astonishment, Sarah Judd walked straight to the repeating rifle, opened the sliding plate in its stock, and took out the closely folded letter. Perhaps Nan Shelley and Agatha Lord were no less surprised than Irene; also they were deeply chagrined. But O'Gorman's slip in calling Sarah Judd "Josie" had conveyed to his associates information that somewhat modified their astonishment at the girl's cleverness, for everyone who knew O'Gorman had often heard of his daughter Josie, of whom he was accustomed to speak with infinite pride. He always said he was training her to follow his own profession, and that when the education was complete, Josie O'Gorman would make a name for herself in the detective service. So Nan and Agatha exchanged meaning glances and regarded the freckle-faced girl with new interest. "I'm not much of a reader," said Josie, carefully unfolding the paper. "Suppose we let Miss Irene read it." Her father nodded assent and Josie handed the sheet to Irene. Mr. Hathaway had been growing uneasy and now addressed Officer O'Gorman in a protesting voice. "Is this reading necessary, sir?" "Very necessary, Mr. Hathaway." "What letter is this that you have referred to?" "A bit of information dating nearly 10 years ago, and written by one who perhaps knew more of the political intrigues of John and Beatrice Burrows than has ever come to your own knowledge." "The letter is authentic, then?" "Quite so." "And your department knows of its existence?" "I am acting under the department's instructions, sir. Oblige us, Miss McFarlane," he added, turning to Irene, "by reading the letter in full." End of Chapter 25. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mary Louise by L. Frank Baum. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Chapter 26. The Letter. "This sheet," explained Irene, "is in fact but part of a letter. The first sheets are missing, so we don't know who it was addressed to, but it is signed, at the end, by the initials E. de V." "The ambassador!" cried Hathaway, caught off his guard by surprise. "The same," said O'Gorman triumphantly, "and it is all in his well-known handwriting. Read the letter, my girl." "The first sentence," said Irene, "is a continuation of something on a previous page, but I will read it just as it appears here." And then, in a clear, distinct voice that was audible to all present, she read as follows: "Which forces me to abandon at once my post and your delightful country, in order to avoid further complications. My greatest regret is in leaving Mrs. Burrows in so unfortunate a predicament. The lady was absolutely loyal to us, and the calamity that has overtaken her is through no fault of her own. That you may understand this thoroughly, I will remind you that John Burrows was in our employ. It was through our secret influence that he obtained his first government position, where he inspired confidence and became trusted implicitly. He did not acquire full control, however, until 5 years later, and during that time he met and married Beatrice Hathaway, the charming daughter of James J. Hathaway, a wealthy broker. That gave Burrows added importance, and he was promoted to the high government position he occupied at the time of his death. Burrows made for us secret copies of the fortifications on both the east and west coasts, including the number and caliber of guns, amounts of munitions stored, and other details. Also, he obtained copies of the secret telegraph and naval codes, and the complete armaments of all war vessels, both in service and in process of construction. A part of this information, and some of the plans he delivered to me before he died, as you know, and he had the balance practically ready for delivery when he was taken with pneumonia, and unfortunately expired very suddenly. It was characteristic of the man's faithfulness that on his deathbed he made his wife promise to deliver the balance of the plans, and an important book of codes, to us as early as she could find an opportunity to do so. Mrs. Burrows had previously been in her husband's confidence, and knew he was employed by us while holding his position with the government, so she readily promised to carry out his wishes, perhaps never dreaming of the difficulties that would confront her, or the personal dangers she assumed. But she was faithful to her promise, and afterward tried to fulfil it. Her father, the James J. Hathaway above mentioned, in whose mansion Mrs. Burrows lived with her only child, is a staunch patriot. Had he known of our plot, he would have promptly denounced it, even sacrificing his son-in-law. I have no quarrel with him for that, you may well believe, as I value patriotism above all other personal qualities. But after the death of John Burrows, it became very difficult for his wife to find a way to deliver to me the packet of plans without being detected. Through some oversight at the government office, which aroused suspicion immediately after his death, Burrows was discovered to have made duplicates of many documents entrusted to him, and with a suspicion of the truth, government agents were sent to interview Mrs. Burrows and find out if the duplicates were still among her husband's papers. Being a clever woman, she succeeded in secreting the precious package, and so foiled the detectives. Even her own father, who was very indignant that a member of his household should be accused of treason, had no suspicion that his daughter was in any way involved. But the house was watched, after that, and Mrs. Burrows was constantly under surveillance, a fact of which she was fully aware. I also became aware of the difficulties that surrounded her, and although impatient to receive the package, I dared not press its delivery. Fortunately, no suspicion attached to me, and a year or so after her husband's death, I met Mrs. Burrows at the house of a mutual friend, on the occasion of a crowded reception, and secured an interview with her where we could not be overheard. We both believed that by this time the police espionage had been greatly relaxed, so I suggested that she boldly send the parcel to me, under an assumed name, at Carver's drug store, where I had a confederate. An ordinary messenger would not do for this errand, but Mr. Hathaway drove past the drug store every morning on his way to his office, and Mrs. Burrows thought it would be quite safe to send the parcel by his hand, the man being wholly above suspicion. On the morning we had agreed upon for the attempt, the woman brought the innocent-looking package to her father, as he was leaving the house, and asked him to deliver it at the drug store on his way down. Thinking it was returned goods, he consented, but at the moment he delivered the parcel, a couple of detectives appeared and arrested him, opening the package before him to prove its important contents. I witnessed this disaster to our plot with my own eyes, but managed to escape without being arrested, as a partner in the conspiracy, and thus I succeeded in protecting the good name of my beloved country, which must never be known in this connection." Hathaway was absolutely stupefied at the charge against him. Becoming violently indignant, he knocked down the officers and escaped with the contents of the package. He then returned home, and demanded an explanation from his daughter, who confessed all. It was then that Hathaway showed the stuff he was made of, to use an Americanism. He insisted on shielding his daughter, to whom he was devotedly attached, and in taking the responsibility on his own shoulders. "The penalty of this crime is imprisonment for life, and he would not allow Mrs. Burrows to endure it. Being arrested, he did not deny his guilt, but cheerfully suffered imprisonment. Before the day set for his trial, however, he managed to escape, and since then he has so cleverly hidden himself that the authorities remain ignorant of his whereabouts. His wife and his grandchild also disappeared, and it was found that his vast business interests had been legally transferred to some of his most intimate friends, doubtless for his future benefit. The government secret service was helpless. No one save I knew that Hathaway was shielding his daughter, whose promise to her dead husband had led her to betray her country to the representative of a foreign power such as our own. Yet Hathaway, even in sacrificing his name and reputation, revolted at suffering lifelong imprisonment, nor dared he stand trial through danger of being forced to confess the truth. So he remains in hiding, and I have hopes that he will be able, through his many influential friends, to save himself from capture for many months to come. This is the truth of the matter, dear friend, and as this explanation must never get beyond your own knowledge, I charge you to destroy this letter as soon as it is read. When you are abroad next year, we will meet, and consider this and other matters in which we are mutually interested. I would not have ventured to put this on paper, were it not for my desire to leave someone in this country posted on the Hathaway case. You will understand from the foregoing that the situation has become too delicate for me to remain here. But if you can, give aid to Hathaway, whom I greatly admire, for we are in a way responsible for his troubles. As for Mrs. Burrows, I consider her a woman of character and honour. That she might keep a pledge made to her dead husband, she sinned against the law without realizing the enormity of her offence. If anyone is to blame, it is poor John Burrows, who was not justified in demanding so dangerous a pledge from his wife, but he was dying at the time, and his judgment was impaired. Let us be just to all, and so remain just to ourselves. Write me at the old address, and believe me to be yours most faithfully, E. de V. The 16th of September, 1905. During Irene's reading the others maintained an intense silence. Even when she had ended, the silence continued for a time, while all considered with various feelings the remarkable statement they had just heard. It was O'Gorman who first spoke. "If you will assert, Mr. Hathaway, that the ambassador's statement is correct, to the best of your knowledge and belief, I have the authority of our department to promise that the charge against you will promptly be dropped and withdrawn, and that you will be adjudged innocent of any offence against the law. It is true that you assisted a guilty person to escape punishment, and are therefore liable for what is called misprision of treason, but we shall not press that, for, as I have said before, we prefer, since no real harm has resulted, to allow the case to be filed without further publicity. Do you admit the truth of the statements contained in this letter?" "I believe them to be true," said Mr. Hathaway in a low voice. Mary Louise was nestling close in his arms, and now she raised her head tenderly to kiss his cheek. She was not sobbing; she did not even appear to be humbled or heartbroken. Perhaps she did not realize at the moment how gravely her father and mother had sinned against the laws of their country. That realization might come to her later, but just now she was happy in the vindication of Grandpa Jim, a triumph that overshadowed all else. "I'll take this letter for our files," said Officer O'Gorman, folding it carefully before placing it in his pocketbook. "And now, sir, I hope you will permit me to congratulate you and wish you many years of happiness with your granddaughter, who first won my admiration by her steadfast faith in your innocence. She's a good girl, is Mary Louise, and almost as clever as my Josie here. Come, Nan, come, Agatha, let's go back to Bigby's. Our business here is finished." End of Chapter 26. End of Mary Louise by L. Frank Baum. Read by Sabella Denton in Carrollton, Georgia, in January and February, 2009. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.